Okay, we'll be starting in just a moment. Okay, we'll be starting in just a moment. Okay, we'll be starting in just a moment. Good afternoon. Today's class, as we have it, is going to be, if you want to follow along on the, we're going to be doing cultivating character, life and wisdom from the ethics of our fathers. Today is chapter 6. Those that are on Zoom and on YouTube can follow along with the study guide that we have there. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. Being that we are doing now Ethics of Our Fathers, this is the 6th week of Ethics of Our Fathers. As we know, the 6 Shabbos is between Pesach and Shavuos. We study Ethics of Our Fathers. The last chapter of Ethics of Our Fathers is considered the chapter of Kinyan Torah, acquiring the Torah. It is because it discusses the obligations and it discusses the concepts of how one studies Torah. Because of that, it is read always and is studied always the Shabbos before Shavuos, being that on Shavuos is the time that we celebrate when God gave us the Torah. So in order to prepare ourselves accordingly for Shavuos, we study the 6th chapter of Ethics of Our Fathers. Interesting to note that this chapter is not actually part of the original chapters of Ethics of Our Fathers. If you were to open up a Mishnah, you would not find this 6th chapter there. This is an additional, it's called a Tosefta, and this was added that we read it before and study it before the holiday of Shavuos in preparation for Shavuos. Traditionally, this chapter is known as Kinyan Torah, acquiring the Torah. So let's look at today. We're going to pick one Mishnah, one paragraph from this chapter and discuss it and analyze it and how we can better prepare ourselves in understanding and appreciating what the Torah is all about. The Mishnah states as follows. I'll put it up on the screen. If those that have it can see it in Zoom, it's right here. The Mishnah states as follows. There are 5 acquisitions that God has acquired in this world. Heaven and earth are one acquisition. Abraham is one acquisition. The people of Israel are one acquisition, and the Holy Temple is one acquisition. And the Mishnah continues, the Torah, as it is written, God acquired as in the beginning of his way before his works. A quote from Proverbs. Heaven and earth, as it is written, so says God, the heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. What house then can you build for me in my place? How many are your works? Then he continues, Abraham, as it is written, he blessed and said, blessed be Abraham to God Most High. The people of Israel, because it says in another verse, until your nation, O God, will pass, until this nation you have acquired will pass. The Holy Temple, the base for your dwelling that your God have achieved, the sanctuary, Lord, your God has established. What we see over here is many different terminologies using of these 5 items that the Mishnah mentions, the 5 items namely being the Jewish people, heaven and earth, the Holy Temple, Abraham, and using a terminology of acquisition. When we talk about a terminology of acquisition, what does it mean to acquire? Generally speaking, the word acquisition means I've accomplished something, I've taken something, I now own it, something that I didn't have until now. Now, if you look at these items that the Mishnah mentions here, the Mishnah mentions the people of Israel, the Holy Temple, Abraham, the heaven and earth. What does it mean that God acquired them? He didn't have them until now. The heaven and earth God created. The Jewish people God made. Abraham was around. What does it mean that God acquired these things? Acquired means I'm getting something I didn't have until now. And the commentaries explain and say the terminology for acquisition here doesn't literally mean that he acquired getting something that he didn't have until now, but it's something that you cherish. It's something that you buy, something that you invest in. You have more of a value for, you appreciate more than something that you have ordinarily, or something that just happened to you by happenstance. And over here, the Mishnah is telling us that these 5 things God cherishes in his world more than other things as well. Give you an example, and this is a powerful story. It's a story that's been going around on the internet, so the veracity of the story is like every other story going around on the internet, believe it or not, but the message is still very important. So the story goes as follows. There was this elderly fellow, about a 95-year-old guy, who contracted, unfortunately, the infection of COVID-19, and he had to be hospitalized. And when he was hospitalized, he had to be intubated. And when he was intubated, finally, he was able to be extubated, to come out of the hospital. And while he was coming out of the hospital, he got the bill from what the hospital charged him. And he's looking at the bill and he's crying. And the doctor comes over to him. He says, young old man, or old fella, or young fellow, whatever he called him at the time. And he said, what are you concerned about? If it's about the bill, we can make arrangements. The hospital has different arrangements that they can make. You don't have to worry about it. And the old man says, I'm not crying about the hospital bill. What I'm crying about is I'm looking at the hospital bill and it says it charged me $1,000 a day to be on the ventilator. That means it charged me $1,000 a day for me to breathe. He says, I've been alive for 90 years. I've never realized the importance of what it is to breathe. I've always taken it for granted. You wake up in the morning, you're sleeping, at night you're breathing. Only now that I appreciate what it means, this virtue of breathing, because it said it cost $1,000 for me to breathe. When something costs money, we all of a sudden create a certain specific value to it. We find it more important. We cherish it more. We realize its greatness. There's another story told about Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev, and I've said the story many times, but it's still a good story. The story of that, today we live in a small world that we can get anything from anywhere in the world at any time, just put it on a plane and you get it a few days later. So as you know, when it comes to the holiday of Sukkot, we get the 4 kinds, the lulav, the esrog, the adasim, and the aravas, and most of them are from different countries, especially the esrog. Either comes from Israel or comes from South Italy. And in days of old, it wasn't so easy to get such type of, to procure a esrog, a lulav, or a dasim. It was very difficult. And it was very common that the entire town would use one lulav and esrog. And so happened in Berditchev as well, that there was no lulav and esrog. And all of a sudden, they put messengers in different corners and different places and different crossroads to stop anybody that has a lulav and esrog, and ask them if they would be willing to spend Sukkot in the town so everybody can enjoy to make a blessing on the lulav and the esrog. At that point, they met this businessman who said, no, I wanted to go home to my family. I have no interest in being in Barditchev. So they said, come meet Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev said, if you stay in our town and we get to use your lulav and esrog, I guarantee you my share of the world to come. He heard that. He can't refuse such an offer. So he said, sure. Well, lo and behold, he stays in the town for the holiday of Sukkot. But that night, the first night of Sukkot, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak sends out a message. Nobody invite this guy to his home, to his Sukkah, to eat. Okay. But don't tell the guy. All of a sudden, this guy comes the first night of Sukkot, comes knocking on the doors, trying to get into somebody's home to be able to eat in their Sukkah. He wants to do the blessing. Nobody lets him in. From door to door, Sukkah to Sukkah, and he felt, what's going on over here? Nobody let him into the Sukkah. He realized that this must be a command from higher ups. So he goes to Rabbi Levi Yitzchak's house and says, what kind of business is this? I stay here to give you my lulav and esrog, and you don't even let me in your Sukkah. How can that be? So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak says, I'll let you in my Sukkah on one condition. If you give up that share in the world to come that I promised you. He said, for sure, for me to eat in the Sukkah, what's it going to do good for me? I have to eat in the Sukkah today. He said, fine. After Sukkot, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak calls this fellow in, and this fellow was very upset, as you can imagine. He says, you tricked me. You wanted me to stay here, so you promised me the world to come. Then I needed a Sukkah, so you took it away from me. What kind of business is this? Rabbi Levi Yitzchak explained to him and said, when I gave you this share in the world to come, you didn't earn it. you would feel so out of it. Imagine having a share in the world to come, which you didn't earn, it didn't belong to you. What would you feel like? I wanted you to earn it. Now that you were willing to give up the share in the world to come in order to be in a sukkah, you now earn that share in the world to come. So when the Mishnah tells us about the word acquisition, it doesn't necessarily mean acquire something he didn't have before, but it's telling us a precious possession. There's a deeper meaning to this word of the Mishnah. A Mishnah tells us that the acquisition that does apply to God, because now these 5 things are the most 5 things cherished by God. Rashi, the commentary, explains that we find that Abraham uses different terminologies when he talks about God. When making his servant Eliezer swear, he says as follows in Genesis chapter 24. He says, now he is the God of the heaven and the God of the earth, because I have made him familiar with in the mouths of the people. But when he took me from my father's house, he was only the God of the heavens, not the God of the earth. What was Abraham telling his servant? Abraham was saying, God may be everywhere, but if we can't identify with God, then what does that mean? If we ignore God, then how is he a God of the earth? God only becomes a God of the earth when he is identified, when people on earth actually come to appreciate and recognize godliness. And this, in a sense, God did acquire because of Abraham. When Abraham went around to teach people the word of God, and when Abraham went around teaching people about God, only then did God acquire earth, because until then, nobody knew about it. They say a famous story about the Rabbi of Kotsk, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk. He was a very witty fellow, student of the Maggid of Mezrich. His name was Rabbi Menachem Mendel Margaretin. He lived in 1787 through 1859. And once he came out of his room and he saw a group of Hasidim standing there. And he stormed at them and said, "Where is God?" The Hasidim thought he lost his mind. They started explaining to him, God is here, God is there, God is everywhere, and everything else. And again he says, but where is God? Finally, the Chassidim looked at him in amazement. Okay, so you tell us. And he looked at him and says, you want to know where God is? Wherever you let him in. Wherever you let God in, that's where he is. What is the Mishnah telling us here? When the Mishnah tells us about the different things that God acquired, and the Mishnah then, so to speak, gives a proof to God's acquisition, it tells us about how the king of Jerusalem at the time, Al-Kitzadek, he declared, blessed are you, Abraham, on God Most High, you acquired the heaven and earth. What was he saying? That he was saying that until Abraham came along, God couldn't acquire heaven and earth. Until Abraham came along, God was only the God of the heavens. What did people on earth even know about Abraham? So Abraham defined for God, so to speak, or defined earth, or made earth a place that God can acquire, a place that God can feel at home, a place that we can seek God and see God. And the same is true with the other acquisitions that are mentioned in the Mishnah. The other ones, when it talks about the Torah, the people of Israel, the Holy Temple, all of these aspects are when the consciousness of the individual, or how God, by virtue of having created them, is not necessarily making them holy. But God only acquires something when it becomes his, meaning when those that are there recognize it. For example, the Holy Temple. Why was that an acquisition of God? Because in the Holy Temple, one was able to feel godliness. The Jewish people, by definition, are able to feel godliness when he chose them to be the ones on Mount Sinai. And the same idea applies to any other of those items that are mentioned. When they come to understand and appreciate the level of holiness, only then can they are they considered acquired by God, because then they have relevance. But what about heaven and earth? Heaven and earth, God's created. How can we say God has to acquire heaven and earth? And there's another deeper meaning in it. We know that one of the things that the giving of the Torah, Mount Sinai, accomplished was the fusion of physical and spiritual. Before Mount Sinai, a person can do very spiritual acts, but he cannot transform and change the physical item. Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, as great as they were, they couldn't put on tefillin. They couldn't put on tzitzis. They couldn't write a letter in the Torah. They couldn't have a mezuzah. All the spiritual greatnesses, but they couldn't transform or fuse a physical item with spirituality. Physical and spiritual, two entities. What happened when God gave the Jewish people the Torah? He gave them the ability that they now can take something physical and transform it into something spiritual. They now had the ability to take earth and make it heaven-like. This is an interesting debate between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. And that's brought down in the Talmud. And the Talmud says as follows. The school of Shammai says, what was created first? Heaven and earth. He says, well, heaven was created earth. As it says in the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. The school of Hillel said, earth was created first, and then heavens, because it says in the verse, they, God Almighty, made earth and heavens. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai came along and said, I wonder why they're arguing. He says, heaven and earth were created together, like a pot with a cover. Heaven and earth are one entity. Heaven and earth are one concept. Heaven and earth is something that God is telling us over here, that this is an idea and something which we need to look at as one entity. And therefore it may seem as two separate entities, spiritual and physical, heaven and earth. But with the creation and with the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, God said it's a lid with a cover. You can't have one without the other. You can't have the earth without the heaven. You can't have the heaven without the earth. And this is what it means that God acquires it, because each one requires one another. This is a fundamental Hasidic teaching, that every single thing that there is in Torah is interrelated and interconnected. That just because the code of Jewish law has something of one nature, the mystical concept of it must relate to it. It's like the heaven and earth. One is a mirror reflection of another. And the difference is only one is the body, one may be the soul. And it comes also into every single concept in the Torah. It's all true. It's just different ways and lenses of looking at the same idea. So if we're looking at something here, every single aspect in the Torah has something to teach us. So even something of code in Jewish law, code of Jewish law tells us that a father is obligated to do the following for his son: to circumcise him, redeem him, to teach him Torah, to find a wife for him to marry, and to teach him a trade. Taking these laws, we can see something very unique, how in our own lives in relationship with God and with relationship with one another, these five things reflect about these five acquisitions that we just mentioned. To perform the mitzvah of circumcision corresponds to God's covenant with Abraham. The ultimate expression was and remains the rite of circumcision. To redeem him takes us to the Jewish people when God redeemed us from the land of Israel. To teach us Torah, the first divine acquisition, God, as listed in the Mishnah, is the actual Torah that God gave us and gave us the ability to study Torah and to fuse that physical and spiritual. To marry him corresponds with the Holy Temple, where we were able to bask in God's glory, cultivating that relationship, which is symbolic of that marital home, that relationship that we have with God. And to teach him a trade refers to the final acquisition that we mentioned in the Mishnah, heaven and earth, the natural order that sustains all existence. Over here, God is telling us and gives us these five gifts. He gives us these five qualities and abilities that we are able to not only sustain ourselves physically, but also mentally and spiritually. God gives us the tools that we should be able to fuse heaven and earth, which is the Torah. When we study the Torah, realizing and acknowledging that this is the wisdom of God, when we study the Torah and realize the multifaceted parts of the Torah, that it's not just a theory, it's a practical roadmap of our life. It helps us identify and clarify how we can be better people, better relationships, and have a better impact in this world. We then see and cherish these five things that God cherishes so much because we, the Jewish people, cherish them as well. This hopefully will help us understand and appreciate a little better as we prepare for the giving of the Torah next Friday, which is the holiday of Shavuos, climbing from Pesach until Shavuos, getting ready for this time, And every single year, the Torah is given to us again from new. And our recommitment and our rededication to the Torah, of our job that we have to do, which we are tasked with, fusing the physical and the spiritual, making this world a spiritual oasis for God. Thank you for tuning in today. Tomorrow, lunch break with the Rabbi at 1 p.m. for Parsha class and a pre-sermon, if you want to call it, for the upcoming week. As well as next week, Tuesday night, there's going to be that cooking class. We'll post all the information. And Wednesday night, there's going to be the positivity bias, continuing with lunch break with the Rabbi at 1 p.m. Wishing you the very best. Have a wonderful day and all the best.